Hi, and welcome back to the third video in our Cybersecurity Risk series. My name is Kelly Hood, and I'm a cybersecurity engineer with Optic Cyber Solutions. Today, I really want to talk about how do we identify, track, and ultimately manage our cybersecurity risk. We have a few other videos in this series, and so you may want to take a look at those earlier videos for a few key terms, but we will go over a few of them as we go as well. So I wanted to start off by talking about our general process for managing risk, and you can see that here in our Know Your Risk process. And really how we like to start off is by thinking about what is it that we care about? What are our critical assets and data? That's really the first step in the process, thinking about what is it that matters most to us so that we know how to protect it and prevent against attacks in the future. Once we think about what is important to us and we know what those assets and data are, we can think about what vulnerabilities and threats may affect those. Here we can think about, do we have any known weaknesses, or do we have any common threat vectors maybe? What are those things that we know that we should be concerned about and that we need to be looking at? After we've identified the vulnerabilities and threats, we think about the likelihood and impact of exploit. If that threat acted upon the vulnerability to create a risk event, how bad would it be? Would it be if it was a catastrophic impact or an overall catastrophic risk? It was something we may need to act on faster compared to a lower risk item. But these are all things we can start to look at as we measure the likelihood and impact of these risks and help to classify them based on their severity. Moving on to the next item. Once we understand that severity, we can prioritize the risks to then help ourselves to know how to handle them, how to mitigate them, or manage that risk to ultimately reduce it and build resilience in our organizations. So how do we do that? And this is where things get a little bit tricky. We need to start thinking about, what are we trying to protect? Where do we start? And how do we begin this process of risk management? One of the ways that we'd like to jump in a lot of times is actually to work backwards. As we're thinking about what are those critical assets and the data that we're trying to protect, why are we worried about that? Or if something bad happened to it, what would we be worried about? And so we'll start with that risk, and then we can break it down into the threats and vulnerabilities, and then start thinking about the likelihood and impact. So rather than starting with all the vulnerabilities, a lot of times we like to start with the risks themselves and think about those. So here I've broken them down for cybersecurity into three categories of loss of customer data, disclosure of customer data, or modification of proprietary information. And these three risks will really help us to think across the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, availability triad of cybersecurity. So these might be different for everybody. For this example, I'm just picking some really high-level risks that will likely have many different vulnerabilities and threats that could act upon these, but wanted to start off with an example here to kind of show you how you can take a conceptual risk such as loss of customer data and break it down and think through those vulnerabilities and threats that could act upon it. So here we're starting to add in those vulnerabilities. And as we think across these different types of risks and start thinking about what could be exploited here, what types of vulnerabilities do we have? We may have exposed sensitive documents, you can see on the left. We may have limited equipment that could lead to, if there was somebody stole that could lead to a loss of customer data. If we start thinking about disclosure of customer data, we might have concerns around, code error or some sort of, web application attack that could cause disclosure of that data. So we've got several examples here, just thinking through what are those different avenues of attack that could occur and what vulnerabilities might be able to be exploited. Once we understand those vulnerabilities, we can then think about the threats. So what would act upon those vulnerabilities and exploit them to ultimately reach that risk? So in this case, we have over on the left side, we've got natural disasters. So that could be a hurricane, that could be a tornado, it could be a lot of different things that would then lead to either the papers blowing down the street that we discussed from the previous videos, or maybe damaging equipment that would cause an outage, and we would maybe lose that data. We can see over in the middle, we've got looking at different types of users, a general user or a privileged user that may have access and be able to create a code error, or maybe just make an accident and have an error in the code that would lead to a disclosure. So there's a lot of different possibilities here, and this is just a few examples, even though it's already looking messy. But really, this is an exercise that I think is valuable for a lot of companies to just kind of think through and work backwards of, what is it that you don't want to see in the news? What is that risk that you're worried about? And then what are the vulnerabilities and what are the threats that could potentially act upon them? And that leads me here to the risk register. So this is just an example. A lot of times we'll track it in an Excel spreadsheet or something of the sort, where you can have the information all captured in one place, where you can document, what are the potential threats, and it may be multiples. It may not matter if it's an insider or an outsider. If they're able to affect your code or a database of information, then it would still be bad and have a negative impact on the organization. So you can document what are those potential threat sources, what are those vulnerabilities to create that risk event. And then once we have the risk event, we can go back through and start thinking about the likelihood and impact that we talked about in the last video of how likely is this to occur. Do we live in Tornado Alley? Do we think we're going to have that happening a lot of time? Or, what is the impact? Is this something is it a little pothole that we're going to be able to jump over? Or is this something that's going to be a large chasm that we're really going to have to stop and think about how to handle? And ultimately, once we get to that risk level, we'll be able to better prioritize. Once we get them all in a list and we can look side by side and look at our different risks and better understand how to prioritize and where to start first. And as you work through this exercise, remember, don't get distracted by the potholes. A lot of times there will be a lot of things that end up on this risk register. The more granular you get, the easier each individual risk will be to manage, but it might be harder to manage the overall list if it gets too big. What we really want to do is find that nice balance between understanding what are our risks and being able to prioritize them to figure out how much we care. What are those high highs? What are the low lows? What can we accept on the lower end? Where do we really need to take some action to manage to transfer that risk on the higher side to make sure that we're managing our business and our cybersecurity risks appropriately? So I hope this has been helpful for you to think about how to break down cybersecurity risk a little bit, working backwards from the risks themselves, thinking about those threats and vulnerabilities, and ultimately measuring them to help reduce risk and build resilience over time. We have a few resources here on the Optic website, including a risk register template that can help you just get started as you think about those risks and track that information. We also have a few industry guidance or industry resources here that can be used for guidance from 830 to NIST 8286 and the RMF, the risk management framework that NIST has also put out. So I hope this has been helpful. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all around risk, and let us know if you've been interested in this series, if you would like us to create other videos around cybersecurity risk. My name is Kelly Hood. Thanks again for watching.